Steve Cubby, and this is part one of our two-part interview with Washington State legal authority and attorney Jeffrey Steinborn. And we are going to be asking Mr. Steinborn about the new law, I-502, which has a very stringent requirement that anyone with anything over 5 billionths of a gram of cannabis metabolite is automatically guilty of a very serious felony, driving under the influence of a drug. So, Jeff, what can you tell us about the new law?
Before I-502, if you were charged with driving under the influence and it was marijuana or some other drug, the state had to prove that you were impaired. And as a defense, you could establish that you were not impaired. Under I-502, impairment is not an element. If your blood THC level is above, active THC is above 5 nanograms, you are per se guilty of driving under the influence, whether you're impaired or not, and there's no defense. You can't raise any defense except maybe attack the laboratory. Now, the science is clear. It couldn't be more clear that there is no scientific correlation between levels of THC, at least not at 5 nanograms, and impairment of your driving abilities. So what we got is essentially the change is that if you got 5 nanograms of THC in your system, and a lot of people do, long after any impairment is gone, then you're guilty of DWI. If you are driving down the street and some fool jumps out in front of you and dies on your bumper, and it's not your fault at all, you're guilty of vehicular homicide if your blood level is above 5 nanograms, period, whether you're impaired or not, whether it's your fault or not. So that's the legal difference. If they get your blood and they show above 5 nanograms, you are guilty, period, whether you're impaired or not. Police will now shake you down for cannabis if you're driving for almost any reason. You look like you might smoke it, you got a cannabis sticker on your window, or you got long hair, or you're young. I mean, certainly if you smell a pot, really for any reason, and sometimes for no reason, they will shake you down for cannabis and generate enough suspicion to go take your blood. And if you're under 21 and there's any cannabis in your system, you're guilty of DWI. And if you're over 21, there's 5 nanograms. And what the scientific studies show is that for chronic users, that active THC can stay at 5 nanograms for days and days and days after your last consumption. So there is simply no connection between that level. On the public defender's email list, they're now putting out inquiries collecting anecdotes of new DWI cases. It's become a whole new category for them to deal with is these green DUIs. So yeah, the answer is it's taken a while, but the police are becoming aware of their new powers and they're starting to use them more and more. In the liberal city of Seattle, black people were being arrested for marijuana misdemeanors at 3 or 4 times the rate of white people, period. And we are one of the better counties in the state. The statistics show other counties are worse. Now, I am assuming that this same racial imbalance will appear in the statistics for stopping people for DWI. And let's face it, a DWI conviction is so much more serious, so much more life-shattering than a simple misdemeanor conviction, which can result in a day in jail and a small fine, at the worst. DWI, costs you probably $10,000 in legal fees. It means you can't go to Canada. You can't afford insurance. Sometimes you lose your license. The consequences are catastrophic. Will there be more DWIs than there were misdemeanors? Nobody knows yet, but I think there's a serious threat of that. This is the new prohibition.
Well, that's pretty serious, Jeff. What advice do you have for people in Washington State who are pulled over by law enforcement?
A cannabis user should prepare for being pulled over. I call it Steinborn's first law, which is one law at a time. Only break one law at a time. If you're holding, if you're smoking, don't drive. If you're in your car, it better not smell a pot. Your eyes better not be glassy. You better not have pot in your teeth or pot on your clothes. You better not have a pot sticker or a pot button. Anything that tips off the cop that you might be involved with cannabis, you don't want to have with you when you're driving your car, period. And then as a general rule, you want to obey all the laws. You want to have your license tabs up to date, all your tail lights and headlights working. You want to signal when you turn, you don't want to speed. I mean, nowadays it's open season on cannabis users when you get on the road, and if you get a cop who suspects you, they will generate a reason to get a blood test. And one of the ways they generate it is by asking you questions. And you got to be careful what questions you answer. Are you a medical user? I wouldn't answer that if I'm asked. I'd ask them, well, what medicines do you use, officer? I'm not going to tell you unless you want to become my doctor. I'm not going to tell you what medicines I use. I haven't used any medicines today. But you never admit to being a medical user because it doesn't defend you. When they want you to do the field sobriety tests, those tests are really a law enforcement scam. There is no way to pass them. They're like a Ouija board. They do what the officer wants them to do. And any officer can find reason to say that you're impaired even when you're not. So the common wisdom is you respectfully decline to take those field sobriety tests. And if they ask you to get out of the car, you ask them, am I being detained? Am I under arrest? And when you get out, if you use the car, if you lean on the car to stand up, they're going to mention that. He looked like he was impaired because he had to hold on to the door to stand up. So you want to try to avoid giving them any evidence at all. I just ask him, look, officer, am I free to go, or are you going to write me a ticket? I don't even say. I'm not going to tell you about any of those questions you're asking me. Sometimes it pisses them off, and sometimes they realize that the best way to let a cop know you understand your rights is to exercise them. It doesn't do any good to say, hey, I know my rights. You don't have a right to ask me that question, blah, blah, blah. They own the streets. You can't tell them what to do, but you can show them you know your rights by simply quietly and courteously exercising those rights.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Attorney Jeff Steinborn, for taking the time to explain these important issues. This has been Steve Kubby. You can catch our show at KubbyTV.com, PotTV.com, CannabisCulture.com, and other premium cannabis websites. In the meantime, take care and have a great 420 day.